In 1952, the Meccano factory at Binns Road sprawled across 6 acres of Liverpool, 245,000 square feet of British engineering, teaching children how the world works. Today, 1,500 parking spaces cover the ground where the presses once shook the floor. A Costa Coffee stands where the tool room used to be. In the centre of a retail park roundabout, a 30-foot liverbird built from Meccano parts watches over the absence. The sculpture is made from the same perforated strips and angle brackets that were manufactured here for 65 years. A monument assembled from the components of its own disappearance. How does a factory that shaped a generation's understanding of how things fit together become a place you drive past, on the way to Curry's? How does a name that meant precision and permanence vanish so completely that only a metal bird remains to mark where it stood? The answer begins with a patent filed by a Liverpool clerk in 1901. It ends with 950 workers given minutes to learn their world was over. There is a roundabout in Old Swan, Liverpool, where the traffic circles endlessly past a Costa Coffee and a Curry's electrical shop. 1,500 parking spaces spread across the tarmac. Families load flat-pack furniture into their cars. Teenagers drift toward the cinema. The retail park hums with the ordinary commerce of a Saturday afternoon. And in the centre of the roundabout stands a 30-foot bird. It is the liverbird, Liverpool's ancient symbol, wings spread, beak open, but built entirely from Meccano parts. Perforated metal strips, angle brackets, bolts and nuts. The same components that, for 65 years, were manufactured on this very ground. The sculpture is a memorial, a tribute to something that once stood here, something that employed nearly 1,000 people, something that taught generations of British children how things fit together, how an axle turns, how a gear meshes, how a crane lifts, how the world works. The Binns Road factory is gone. Demolished in the early 1980s, the exact year lost to conflicting records. The land cleared, the memory paved over. But if you know what you're looking for, you can still find traces. The curve of Edge Lane, where workers once walked from the terraced streets of Wavertree. The railway line that brought raw materials to the loading bays. The angle of the afternoon light, falling now on a Morrison's supermarket, where the tool room used to be. This was Meccano Ltd. This was Dinky Toys. This was the place where a Liverpool clerk's kitchen table invention became a global empire, and then, in the space of a single winter, vanished. Nearly 950 workers were given minutes to learn their jobs were gone. They occupied the factory, they refused to leave. They kept working without pay, in the dark and the cold, while management cut the heating and the lights. They held out for 14 weeks, until bailiffs and police came through the gates on a March morning in 1980. And then silence. The machinery that had run 3 shifts a day for decades stopped. The presses that had stamped out 1 million miniature vehicles went cold. The building where children's imaginations were manufactured in metal and precision. That building was knocked down, carted away, and replaced with car parks. How does that happen? How does a factory that defined a childhood, that shaped a district's identity, that put Liverpool engineering in the hands of children across the world, how does it go from empire to empty ground in the space of a single generation? The answer begins not in the boardrooms where the final decisions were made, nor in the economic pressures that squeezed the life from British manufacturing. It begins in a small workshop at the turn of the century, where a man with no engineering degree and no family money looked at a piece of perforated metal and saw something no one else could see. Frank Hornby was not, by any conventional measure, destined for greatness. Born in Liverpool in 1863, he grew up in the cramped streets of a city that built ships and moved cargo. His father was a provisions merchant. His education was ordinary. By his 30s, he was working as a clerk, a bookkeeper, shuffling invoices and ledgers in a world of ink and paper. But Hornby had 2 qualities that would change everything: a gift for mechanical thinking and children to entertain. The story, as it has come down through the years, is simple enough. Hornby wanted to build toys for his sons. Real toys. Not the painted tin soldiers or wooden blocks that filled Victorian nurseries, but something that could move, that could lift, that could do work. He wanted his boys to understand how machines operated, not as abstract ideas from a textbook, but as physical realities they could hold in their hands. The problem was that building such toys required a workshop, lathes, drills, precision tools, the kind of equipment a clerk could never afford. So Hornby asked a different question. What if the parts themselves were standardized? What if a child could build a crane, take it apart, and build a locomotive from the same pieces? What if construction became a system rather than a craft? He began experimenting in his workshop at home. Strips of metal, holes punched at regular intervals, bolts and nuts to hold them together, simple components that could combine in infinite configurations. On the 9th of January 1901, Hornby filed his patent application. The document that would launch an empire was titled, with characteristic Victorian directness, Improvements in Toy or Educational Devices for Children and Young People. That phrase, toy or educational, matters. Hornby understood, perhaps before anyone else, that the two were not opposites. A toy could teach, play could be preparation. The patent describes not merely a construction set, but a useful educational device designed to reduce the laboriousness of turning, boring and careful adjustment that made mechanical work inaccessible to young people. The patent specification reads like a manifesto. It describes metal strips and angle pieces, perforated with holes preferably about ½ an inch apart, fixed by bolts and nuts. It suggests that a set might include practical tools, a small file, a screwdriver, round-nosed pliers, even cardboard sheets for roofs and floors. Everything a child needed to build the world in miniature. What Hornby had invented was not merely a toy, it was a philosophy. The idea that children should work with real materials, that they should understand tolerance and tension, friction and force. That engineering was not a profession reserved for the wealthy and educated, but a way of thinking available to anyone with patience and a box of parts. He called his invention Mechanics Made Easy. The early years were not easy. Hornby had no factory, no capital, no distribution network. He made sets by hand and sold them where he could. The name was clumsy. The market was uncertain. Established toy manufacturers saw no reason to fear a clerk with a workshop full of perforated strips. But the sets worked. Children who received them discovered something remarkable. The satisfaction of building something that functioned. A crane that lifted. A bridge that held weight. A vehicle that rolled. By 1907, Hornby had registered a new name for his system. Meccano. Crisper. More modern. Easier to remember. And by 1912, the demand had outgrown anything a home workshop could supply. Hornby established Meccano France to serve the continental market. But he needed something larger, something permanent, a factory that could manufacture his vision at scale. He found it on Binns Road. The site that would become Meccano's headquarters sat in the Edge Lane corridor, in the district where Old Swan met Wavertree. It was industrial Liverpool, the kind of neighbourhood where factories and terraced houses pressed against each other, where the rhythm of work and home were separated by a short walk and a works hooter. In 1914, as Europe stumbled toward war, Frank Hornby opened his new factory. The timing might have seemed disastrous. Young men who should have been working assembly lines were marching toward trenches. Raw materials were being requisitioned for armaments. The toy trade, one might have thought, would be among the first casualties of a continent at war. But Hornby's invention had something that proved unexpectedly valuable: precision. The same skills that manufactured miniature gears and axles could be turned to other purposes. The factory that made children's construction sets could make components for military equipment. Binns Road survived the war years by being useful, and when peace returned, Meccano was perfectly positioned for the boom that followed. The 1920s saw the factory expand. New buildings, new machinery, new workers walking through the gates each morning. What had been one man's workshop invention was becoming an industrial enterprise. hundreds of employees manufacturing products that were shipped across Britain and beyond. Hornby understood something about marketing that many of his competitors missed. He didn't just sell construction sets, he sold a world. In 1916, he launched Meccano magazine, a monthly publication filled with models, competitions, and technical articles. It wasn't advertising in the conventional sense. It was community building. Boys who owned Meccano sets weren't just customers. They were members of something larger. The magazine depicted the Binns Road factory with pride. Photographs showed the distinct departments, the press room, the tool-making shop, the packing area, each one a stage in the journey from raw metal to finished product. Children who read the magazine could imagine the place where their toys were born. They could picture the workers who made them. The factory became mythic. By the early 1930s, Hornby was ready for his next innovation. Die-casting had been used in manufacturing for decades, but Hornby saw its potential for toys. The process involved forcing molten metal into precision moulds under high pressure, a technique that could produce smooth, detailed surfaces and consistent quality at scale. In 1931, the factory began producing small accessories for Hornby's model railway sets, miniature vehicles to populate the tiny stations and crossings. These accessories proved unexpectedly popular. Children wanted more of them, different vehicles, greater detail, a whole fleet of miniature transport. In 1934, Meccano Ltd formalised this new product line. They called it Dinky Toys. The name was perfect. Dinky, small, neat, charming. Toys, unambiguous, unpretentious. And the product itself was unlike anything else on the market. Die-cast vehicles made from Zarmak, a zinc alloy that gave them weight and durability. You could feel the quality the moment you picked one up. Cold metal, solid heft, the satisfying density of something real. Within a year, there were over 200 different products in the Dinky range. Lorries and cars, buses and tractors, aeroplanes and ships. A miniature inventory of 20th century transport, each one manufactured at Binns Road with the same precision that had made Meccano famous. Frank Hornby did not live to see his empire at its peak. He died in 1936, at the age of 73. But the factory he built, the systems he established, the philosophy he embedded in every perforated strip and die-cast vehicle, these outlived him by decades. The works hooter still sounded over Edge Lane. The shifts still changed. The workers still walked from the terrace streets to the factory gates, knowing they were making something that mattered. Liverpool made things, and Binns Road made the things that taught British children how making worked. Stand at the Binns Road gates on a morning in the early 1950s, and you would see them coming. From Wavertree and Old Swan, from the terrace streets that fanned out along Edge Lane, they walked in clusters and pairs and alone, men in flat caps, women in headscarves, young apprentices nervous on their first day, veterans who had worked these floors since before the war. The factory spread across 6 acres, 245,000 square feet of manufacturing space, most of it single-storey, the buildings connected by covered walkways and loading bays. An aerial photograph from April 1952 shows the scale of it, roof lines stretching across the frame, the works sitting heavy and permanent in its industrial corridor, the railway line curving past for deliveries. Inside, the sound was the first thing you noticed. Not one sound, but layers of them. The rhythmic thump of the presses stamping metal sheets. The whir of lathes shaping precision components. The clatter of parts moving along conveyors. The hiss of compressed air. Underneath it all, a deep industrial hum that you felt through the soles of your feet, as much as heard with your ears. The air carried its own signature. Machine oil, sharp and mineral, hot metal from the die-casting shop, the faint chemical edge of plating solutions, and drifting from the canteen, especially in the mornings, the comfortable smell of frying bacon and strong tea. A Meccano set began as flat metal, steel sheets stacked in the raw materials store. The press room transformed them. Heavy machines punched out the familiar shapes, strips and plates, angle brackets, and flanged pieces. Each one had to be identical. The holes spaced precisely half an inch apart, just as Frank Hornby's patent had specified 50 years earlier. Tolerance mattered. A bolt that didn't fit was a bolt that wouldn't sell. From the press room, parts moved to finishing. Deburring to smooth the punched edges, plating or painting to prevent rust, quality inspection to catch any piece that fell outside specification, then packaging, the intricate work of sorting hundreds of components into boxes, each set complete with its instruction booklet, and the small tools that let children build their first crane or their first motor. The Dinky operation ran parallel but separate. Die-casting was its own discipline. The casting shop was hotter than the rest of the factory. The Zermatt alloy had to be molten, heated in furnaces until it flowed like silver water. Then the dies, precision-machined steel moulds, each one an investment of engineering hours, each one capable of producing thousands of identical vehicles before wearing out. The casting machines worked with controlled violence. Molten metal forced into the die under high pressure. A moment of cooling. The die opening. The raw casting emerging, still warm, trailing thin fins of excess metal that would be trimmed away. But a raw casting wasn't a dinky toy. Not yet. After casting came the work that transformed lumps of metal into miniature vehicles you could believe in. Flash removal, trimming the casting gates and seams, machining where needed. Then the painting line, where chassis received their base coats and details were added by hand or by careful masking. Wheels fitted, axles inserted. Windows, plastic by this era, pressed into place. And finally, inspection. Someone, usually a woman with quick eyes and practiced hands, would pick up each vehicle, turn it over, check the paintwork, test that the wheels spun freely, and either pass it to packing or set it aside. This was the rhythm of Binns Road. Raw materials entering at one end, finished products leaving at the other, thousands of Meccano sets, tens of thousands of dinky vehicles. The pulse of it never stopped. 3 shifts, 7 days a week in the busy seasons. The night shift walking in as the day shift walked out. The machinery running so constantly that the sudden silence of maintenance days felt unnatural, like a heart forgetting to beat. What the workers made here was not merely products. It was precision. It was consistency. It was the promise that a Meccano set bought in Glasgow would contain parts identical to one bought in Southampton, and that those parts would fit together with satisfying exactness. In an age before plastic had conquered the toy industry, before mass production meant disposability, Binns Road manufactured permanence. They called themselves Meccano workers, but the phrase meant more than an employment category. It was an identity, a belonging. Families sent their children to work where their parents had worked. Fathers taught sons how to run the machines they had operated for 20 years. Daughters followed mothers onto the inspection lines. At its peak, the factory employed hundreds of people from the surrounding streets, and many of those people shared surnames, shared addresses, shared Sunday dinners, where the talk inevitably turned to what was happening at the works. The experience of working at Binns Road began for most with the walk. From the terraced houses of Wavertree and Old Swan, workers made their way along Edge Lane toward the factory gates. In winter, they walked in darkness, their breath clouding in the cold. In summer, they walked in light that seemed to arrive too early. The route became automatic, muscle memory mapped onto cobblestones and curbs. At the gates, the clock waited. Clocking in was ritual and record, the mechanical acknowledgement that you had arrived, that your time now belonged to the factory. The card went into the machine. The stamp marked the hour. And then through to your station, your bench, your place in the system. The work was physical, standing for hours, hands in constant motion, the repetitive strain of tasks performed 100 times a day, 1,000 times a week. But there was skill in it too, an expertise that newcomers took months to develop. The best press operators could feel when a die was wearing before the tolerances showed it. The best painters could apply details with a steadiness that machines couldn't match. Women made up a significant portion of the workforce, particularly in assembly and finishing. This was not unusual for British manufacturing of the era, but it would become unexpectedly significant later when the factory's final chapter was written. The women of Binns Road knew their work as well as any man on the floor. They formed friendships that lasted decades. They built lives around the rhythm of the shifts. The factory had its traditions, the works hooter marking shift changes, audible across the neighbourhood, the tea breaks, precise to the minute, the Christmas celebrations, the summer outings. Beauty competitions like Miss Meccano drew crowds to local venues. The Grafton Rooms on West Derby Road featured in such events, connecting the factory to the wider social geography of Liverpool. One account from the Miss Meccano competition captures something essential about what the wages meant. The prize was £15. The winner described it as nearly 2 weeks' wages. That figure anchors the economics of Binns Road in lived reality. This was not genteel office work. This was industrial labour, paid at industrial rates, in an era when such wages could support a family, pay a mortgage, build a life. And build lives they did. Workers met their partners on the factory floor. They raised children who learned to expect the rhythm of shift work as natural. They bought houses in the streets around Edge Lane, close enough to walk, far enough to feel separate from the noise. They drank in the local pubs after the Friday shift, wage packets still warm in their pockets. The factory became a character in the neighbourhood's story. When the works was hiring, the terraces filled up. When the works was thriving, the shops along Edge Lane thrived with it. The prosperity of Binns Road radiated outward. Money spent in local businesses, children sent to local schools, donations made to local causes. This was not merely employment, it was ecosystem. A job at Meccano meant you were making something, not abstract financial products, not services that vanished once rendered. Actual things. Metal toys that children would open on Christmas morning, that would survive years of play, that would be handed down to younger siblings when the older ones outgrew them. There was dignity in that, pride in the tangibility of it. The workers of Binns Road could walk into any toy shop in Britain and see the fruits of their labour on the shelves. They could watch children's eyes light up at the sight of a Dinky car or a Meccano set and know that their hands had played a part in that moment. National Museums Liverpool would later gather oral histories from former employees, capturing memories that spanned from the 1930s through to the final closure in 1979. What emerges from those accounts is not nostalgia in the simple sense, not merely wishing the past was still present, but something deeper. A sense that working at Binns Road had meant something, that the factory had been, in its way, a community as much as a workplace. Those communities are harder to find now. The manufacturing jobs that once anchored working-class neighbourhoods have largely vanished. The walks to work, the clocking in, the shared rhythms, these belong to another era. But the people who lived it remember. There was a period, difficult to pin to a single year, easier to feel than to document, when Binns Road seemed permanent, when the idea that the factory might close, that Meccano might fade, that Dinky Toys might become relics rather than realities, would have seemed absurd. The 1950s and early 1960s were good years. The post-war economy was growing. British manufacturing still mattered. And the products of Binns Road, metal toys built to last, fit perfectly with the values of an era that still remembered scarcity. A dinky car was not disposable. It was investment. Parents who had grown up with rationing understood the virtue of durability. A die-cast vehicle made from Zermatt alloy could survive the kind of punishment only children can deliver. Drops onto hard floors, journeys through sand pits, years of being left out in rain. The metal might scratch, the paint might chip. But the thing itself endured. This mattered. In a world before planned obsolescence became standard practice, before the assumption that toys would break and be replaced, Binns Road manufactured permanence. The weight of a dinky car in a child's hand was not merely physical, it was a promise. And Meccano carried its own weight, both literal and metaphorical. The construction sets were engineered to the same standards as real industrial components. The perforated strips and angle brackets were not simplified toys pretending to be engineering. They were, in miniature, the real thing. A crane built from Meccano actually lifted. A gearbox actually transmitted motion. The principles that made the toy work were the same principles that made the full-scale world work. This was Frank Hornby's vision, brought to industrial fruition. An educational device. A way of thinking about how things fit together. The factory that manufactured these sets was, in a sense, a school, not in any official capacity, but in the practical reality of what it produced. How many British engineers first understood mechanical principles through Meccano? The question cannot be answered with statistics, but the intuition feels sound. A generation of boys, and it was mostly boys in that era, learned to think with their hands. They learned that precision mattered. That tolerance was not a moral virtue, but an engineering requirement. That a bolt must fit its hole exactly, or the structure fails. These lessons, absorbed at kitchen tables across Britain, translated into careers. Into the workshops and factories and design offices where the post-war world was being built. The veterans of Binns Road were making more than toys. They were shaping minds. At its peak, the Dinky range encompassed hundreds of different vehicles. Not merely cars, but the full taxonomy of transport. Lorries and vans, double-decker buses, tractors and farm equipment, military vehicles for boys playing at war, aeroplanes and ships, a comprehensive inventory of how the 20th century moved. The detail mattered too. Dinky vehicles were not crude approximations. They were scale models, designed with reference to the actual vehicles they represented. Collectors, even then there were collectors, appreciated the accuracy, the proportions, the faithful reproduction of liveries and markings. And because they were metal, because they had weight, because they felt substantial in a way that plastic never quite matches, they commanded respect. This was the summit, the moment before the descent. In 1952, when Aerofilms photographed the Binns Road factory from above, the buildings spread across the frame with industrial confidence. 245,000 square feet of manufacturing space. 6 acres of Liverpool given over to the production of childhood. Standing in that factory, watching the presses stamp and the casting machines cycle and the painting lines move, no one could have imagined it ending. The machinery seemed eternal. The market seemed secure. Metal meant quality, and quality meant forever. But forever, as it turned out, was already being challenged. In Denmark, a small company called Lego had been experimenting with plastic building bricks since 1949. By 1958, they had patented a new design, the stud and tube principle that would make their bricks interlock with satisfying precision. The system was different from Meccano, simpler in some ways, more versatile in others, and crucially, plastic was lighter, cheaper, more colourful. And in California, something else was being designed, a new kind of die-cast car, one that prioritised speed and play value over scale accuracy. It would launch in 1968 under a name that promised movement rather than weight: Hot Wheels. The workers of Binns Road didn't know these names, not yet. The children who played with Meccano and Dinky in the late 1950s had no sense that their toys represented one philosophy among several, soon to compete for dominance. The peak is always clearest in retrospect. From within the moment, it feels merely like the present, stable, normal, continuing. But by the early 1960s, the forces that would eventually unmake Binns Road were already in motion. The decisions that would narrow options and foreclose futures were being made in boardrooms far from Liverpool. The market was shifting beneath the factory floor, invisible as groundwater, patient as erosion. 1964 brought the first major change in ownership. Lyons Bro Elms, the company behind Triang Toys, took over Meccano Ltd. It seemed at the time like consolidation, a larger group bringing resources and stability to a smaller manufacturer. Perhaps the workers noticed nothing different. The gates still opened, the shifts still ran, The presses still stamped. But something had changed in the architecture of decisions. The factory that Frank Hornby had built, the works that bore his philosophy in every perforated strip, was no longer entirely its own. It was a division now, a subsidiary, subject to calculations made elsewhere. This was the peak, the absolute summit. And standing at that height, looking out at an empire that seemed as solid as the metal it manufactured, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. The decisions that would change everything were already being made. They just didn't know it yet. The threat did not arrive with trumpets. It crept in quietly, on shop shelves, in the choices children made when their parents offered them a treat. Plastic had been around for decades, of course, but plastic as a serious challenger to metal toys, that was something new. The old assumption held that plastic meant cheap, flimsy, disposable. That serious toys were made from serious materials. That weight equaled quality. Lego had been quietly disproving this assumption since the late 1940s. Their interlocking plastic bricks offered something Meccano could not: instant gratification. A child could build a recognizable structure in minutes, without tools, without bolts, without the patience that Meccano demanded. The bright colours appealed to younger children. The simplicity appealed to parents who didn't want to spend an evening helping with assembly. By the 1960s, Lego had refined their system to near perfection. The stud and tube design meant bricks clicked together with satisfying precision and held firm until deliberately separated. A child could build, unbuild, and rebuild without any parts wearing out. The sets grew more ambitious, not just houses and vehicles, but themed collections that told stories. Meccano's response was hampered by its own identity. The construction sets could evolve, could modernise, could add new components, but they could not abandon their fundamental nature: metal strips with holes, bolts, and nuts. The educational philosophy embedded in every piece. To make Meccano more like Lego would be to make it not Meccano at all. The die-cast market faced its own disruption. In 1968, Mattel launched Hot Wheels. The cars were die-cast, like Dinky. They were small, like Dinky. But there the resemblance ended. Hot Wheels were designed for speed, low-friction wheels, axles engineered to spin freely. The cars came with plastic track, orange loops and curves that sent vehicles racing through gravity-powered stunts. The experience was kinetic, immediate, exciting. Dinky had always been about something else. Scale accuracy, faithful reproduction. The pleasure of holding a miniature vehicle that looked exactly like its full-size counterpart. Dinky cars were for collecting, displaying, imagining. Hot Wheels were for racing. Neither approach was wrong, but children, given the choice, increasingly chose movement over accuracy. The thrill of a car completing a loop-the-loop outweighed the satisfaction of period-correct paintwork. And Hot Wheels were cheaper to produce. The emphasis on play value over scale precision meant tolerances could be looser. The bright, fantastical colour schemes required less careful finishing than Dinky's realistic liveries. The manufacturing economics favoured the newcomer. Inside Binns Road, the shift registered first as puzzlement, then as concern. Sales figures told the story before anyone wanted to hear it. Market share that had seemed permanent began to erode. Not catastrophically, not yet, but persistently. Year by year, the numbers told of children choosing differently. The response was constrained by history. Dinky could not simply become Hot Wheels. The brand meant something. The collectors, and there were collectors now, adults who had grown up with Dinky and continued buying, expected certain things: quality, accuracy, the weight of Zermatt in the hand. Attempts at innovation felt awkward. Dinky introduced features meant to compete with the American upstart: opening doors, moving parts, action features. But grafting novelty onto a product defined by fidelity created confusion rather than excitement. Meanwhile, the ownership structure of Meccano Ltd was becoming increasingly complicated. Lines Bros, who had acquired the company in 1964, ran into their own difficulties. The toy industry was consolidating and fracturing simultaneously. Large conglomerates absorbed smaller manufacturers, seeking economies of scale. But consumer tastes were fragmenting, making those economies harder to achieve. When Lines Bros collapsed in the early 1970s, Meccano found itself passed to Airfix, the plastic model kit company. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered Frank Hornby's metal-first philosophy. The maker of construction sets, built from steel strips and zinc alloy vehicles, now belonged to a company whose expertise was injection-molded plastic. Airfix had its own pressures. The model kit market faced the same generational shifts as construction toys. Children raised on television, and increasingly electronic games, had less patience for assembly. The market for products that required skill and time was shrinking. Each new owner brought new priorities. Each restructuring brought new cost pressures. The factory that had operated with reasonable autonomy under the Hornby family now answered to corporate headquarters in London, where spreadsheets mattered more than heritage. The workers noticed. Of course they noticed. There is a particular anxiety that settles over a factory when decisions start being made elsewhere. When managers arrive from head office with clipboards and concerned expressions, when meetings are held behind closed doors and no one will say exactly what was discussed. Binns Road had survived depressions and wars. It had adapted and evolved through decades of changing tastes. But the forces gathering in the 1970s were different in kind, not just degree. The question was no longer whether the factory could compete. The question was whether anyone with the power to decide believed it was worth trying. Friday, the 30th of November, 1979. The morning shift arrived as usual. Workers walked the familiar route from their homes to the Binns Road gates. They clocked in. They took their stations. The machinery hummed to life. Nothing in the ordinary rhythms of that Friday morning suggested it would be the last. Then came the announcement. Local management had received word from Airfix headquarters in London. The decision had been made. Binns Road was closing. Not restructuring, not reducing shifts. Closing immediately. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but agree in their essence. Workers were given minutes, some say 15, some say 40, to absorb the news that their jobs were gone. Nearly 950 people learned, with almost no warning, that the factory where many had spent their entire working lives was finished. The logic, presumably, made sense on paper. Airfix was struggling. The toy market had shifted. Die-cast production could be moved elsewhere or abandoned entirely. The Binns Road facility, however storied, was expensive to maintain. The workforce, however skilled, was a cost that could be cut. Spreadsheets have no column for heritage. Balance sheets cannot measure what a factory means to a community. What happened next was not in any corporate plan. The workers refused to leave. They did not riot. They did not vandalise. They simply stayed. They occupied the factory that had employed them, that had trained them, that had given shape to their working lives. And they announced that they intended to keep working. The sit-in that began on that Friday would continue through Christmas and into the new year, through the darkest weeks of winter, through negotiations that led nowhere and hopes that flickered and dimmed. Management's response was swift and severe. Within days, the electricity was cut. Then the heating. The telephone lines went dead. The workers who had chosen to occupy Binns Road found themselves in a factory that was being made deliberately uninhabitable. They adapted. They brought torches when the lights went out. They brought heaters and blankets when the temperature dropped. Someone procured a generator. The occupied factory became, in its way, a small community, sharing resources, sharing warmth, sharing the stubborn determination not to surrender without a fight. It was not a strike in the conventional sense. The workers were not bargaining for better conditions. There was nothing to bargain for. The decision was made. The factory was closing. What they were doing was harder to categorise. Protest, certainly. But also something like grief. a refusal to accept that something so solid, so permanent seeming, could simply end. The occupation was led predominantly by women. The women who had worked the inspection lines and the packing stations, who had built relationships across years of shared shifts, who had perhaps less to lose and more to prove. They organised, they spoke to journalists, they maintained discipline when frustration might have broken it. Alternative plans were proposed: find a buyer, form a workers' cooperative, seek municipal support. These were not fantasies. Cooperatives had worked elsewhere, had saved other factories from closure. The workers of Binns Road were not naive. They understood that saving the factory required more than occupation. It required alternatives. But the alternatives required time. Time to find investors. Time to assemble proposals. Time to prove that another way was possible. And time was exactly what they did not have. The weeks passed. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived. 1980 now. A new decade. Though inside the cold and darkened factory, the future felt less like possibility than threat. The legal machinery began to move. Airfix sought an injunction. The High Court granted it. The occupation was, whatever else it might be, a trespass. The workers who had spent their lives in that building had no legal right to remain in it against the wishes of its owners. On the 11th of March 1980, bailiffs arrived at Binns Road. They were accompanied by police. The occupation had lasted 14 weeks. The workers who had held out through winter, who had maintained their protest against cold and darkness, and the grinding certainty of defeat, walked out through the gates one final time. Some accounts describe the scene with details that land hard. Others are sparse, factual, clinical. What is consistent is the finality. The occupation was over. The fight was lost. The gates closed behind them, and the machinery that had run for 65 years went silent. The 14 weeks of occupation deserve their own consideration. Not as a political statement, though it was that. Not as industrial action, though it was that too. But as a human experience. A community of people refusing, for as long as they could, to accept an ending. The cold was the first enemy. A British winter is not forgiving, and a factory without heating becomes hostile quickly. The vast spaces that had once contained the warmth of machinery and bodies turned into refrigerators. Breath clouded, fingers numbed. The metal of the machines, the presses and casting equipment that had run hot for decades, became cold to the touch. The darkness came next. When management cut the electricity, the factory that had blazed with industrial light fell into shadow. The occupied workers brought torches, hand-held and battery-powered, casting beams through spaces designed for thousands of watts of illumination. The effect was disorienting. Familiar routes became unfamiliar. The geography of a workplace known for years became strange and slightly threatening. And the silence. Perhaps worst of all, the silence. A factory is meant to make noise. The rhythm of production is a kind of heartbeat, mechanical, regular, alive. When the machines stopped, when the presses fell still, when the casting shop went cold, the silence pressed in like something physical. The workers who occupied Binns Road through those weeks were not deluded. They knew the odds. They understood that corporate decisions, once made, rarely reverse. But they also knew what the factory meant. To them, to their families, to the streets around Edge Lane that had grown up in its shadow. Some were veterans of decades, men and women who had started as teenagers and worked their way through marriage, parenthood and middle age without ever changing employers. For them, Binns Road was not just a workplace. It was the structure around which their lives had been built. Others were younger, newer to the factory, but no less invested. A job at Meccano had seemed like security, like a career rather than a stopgap. The sudden closure was not just loss of income, but loss of expectation. The future they had assumed was no longer available. The occupation required organisation. Who would stay overnight, and who would go home? How would food be managed, warmth distributed, spirits maintained? The women who led the effort proved adept at logistics. The skills that had run inspection lines, efficiency, attention to detail, the ability to maintain standards under pressure, translated unexpectedly to the demands of protest. There were moments of solidarity from outside. Other workers, other unions, expressed support. Journalists arrived to document the standoff. Politicians made statements. The occupation was news, a human interest story with all the elements that news requires. Conflict, stakes, sympathetic figures standing against faceless corporate power. But solidarity did not pay bills. News coverage did not reverse decisions. The weeks wore on, and the situation did not fundamentally change. Airfix wanted the factory closed. The workers wanted it open. There was no middle ground. Proposals for alternatives circulated. The idea of a workers' cooperative had precedent. Other British factories had been saved by employees buying out failing enterprises. Municipal enterprise was another possibility. Liverpool had its own economic struggles, but perhaps the city could find a way to support a manufacturer that had defined part of its industrial identity. These proposals required capital, planning, time. They required willing sellers and willing supporters. They required, fundamentally, someone with power deciding that Binns Road was worth saving. That decision never came. The High Court injunction was the legal instrument, but the real defeat was slower. The accumulating sense that hope was unreasonable, that determination was not enough, that the gap between what the workers could do and what the situation required was unbridgeable. When the bailiffs came on that March morning, they were met not with violence, but with exhaustion. The workers who had held the factory for 14 weeks understood that the end had arrived. They had done what they could. They had been seen and heard. They had not gone quietly. But they went. The police presence ensured order. The bailiffs ensured compliance. The gates that had welcomed workers for 65 years closed behind them. What remained inside was inventory, machinery, the accumulated equipment of decades. What remained outside was 950 people without jobs, without certainty, without the workplace that had shaped their lives. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of absence, of something that should have been there and was not. The building did not vanish immediately. Factories, unlike the jobs they contain, take time to erase. In the months after closure, Binns Road stood empty, the gates locked, the windows dark. The car park that had held hundreds of vehicles every morning now held weeds pushing through cracks in the tarmac. A property brochure from the period survives. It describes the Binns Road factory in the dispassionate language of commercial real estate. 245,000 square feet. 6-acre freehold site. Single-storey construction. Main services, including sprinklers. The prose is designed to attract buyers, not to mourn losses. What the brochure cannot convey is what the building meant. The square footage tells you nothing about the decades of production. The acreage says nothing about the community built around those acres. The main services are not measured in human terms. The shifts worked, the friendships formed, the skills developed across generations. For a time, there were presumably hopes that another manufacturer might take over. The building was functional, the location was reasonable. Industrial property does not typically sit empty if there are buyers willing to use it. But the early 1980s were not kind to British manufacturing. The sector was contracting. Factories across the country were closing, each one releasing workers and premises into a market with fewer and fewer opportunities. The conditions that had made Binns Road unviable for Meccano made it unattractive for others. The demolition came in the early 1980s. Sources disagree on the exact year. Some say 1980, others 1981. The discrepancy is minor but telling. The end of Binns Road was not a nationally noted event. It was a local loss, recorded imperfectly, remembered by those who cared and forgotten by those who did not. What replaced the factory did not arrive immediately. For years, the cleared site sat as land rather than building, available, undeveloped, waiting. The neighbourhood that had formed around the factory remained, but the anchor that had given it purpose was gone. The brand itself continued to exist, in diminished form. General Mills acquired rights around 1981 as part of the broader consolidation of Airfix's assets. Meccano production moved elsewhere, France, then other locations. The name survived, but the Liverpool connection was severed. Dinky Toys had already ended. UK production ceased with the Binns Road closure in 1979. The brand passed through various corporate hands, revived occasionally for nostalgia-driven releases, never again manufactured in Liverpool. The workers scattered into a labour market that did not want them. Retraining programmes existed, as they always exist, after factory closures. Government initiatives attempted to smooth the transition from industrial to service employment. Some workers found new careers. Others found diminished versions of their previous lives. Part-time work, lower wages, the particular indignity of starting over in middle age. The community around Edge Lane did not collapse exactly. Communities rarely do, at least not all at once. But the loss of the factory removed something central to the area's identity. The shops that had depended on Meccano workers' wages struggled. The pubs that had filled on Friday evenings grew quieter. The terraced streets that had been working-class comfortable began a slower slide toward difficulty. This is the aftermath of industrial closure. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion. The loss of one thing leading to the weakening of another. The fabric of a neighbourhood fraying thread by thread. The workers who had occupied Binns Road through that winter of 1979 and 80 carried their memories into different futures. Some stayed in Liverpool, others moved, seeking opportunities elsewhere. All of them knew something that cannot be taught. What it feels like to fight for something and lose. Today, if you drive along Edge Lane toward Old Swan, you will find what the map calls Liverpool Shopping Park. It is a retail development of the kind that exists in every British city. Large format stores surrounded by parking, the familiar logos of national chains, Currys, Next, Costa Coffee. The architecture is functional, the landscaping is adequate. The traffic circles endlessly around roundabouts designed for vehicular flow rather than human lingering. The shopping park sits on land that once held factories. Meccano's Binns Road Works was one of several industrial facilities in the area. The marketing materials for the development acknowledge this heritage, in the careful way that commercial property acknowledges anything, as colour, as story, as something that adds interest without adding complication. 1,500 parking spaces spread across the tarmac. Families arrive in cars and leave with purchases. The ordinary commerce of a Saturday afternoon proceeds without reference to what stood here before. But in the centre of one of the roundabouts stands the memorial. The Meccano liverbird is 30 feet tall. It was designed by a local artist named Emma Rogers and constructed from Meccano parts. The same perforated strips, angle brackets, bolts and nuts that Frank Hornby patented in 1901. The liverbird itself is Liverpool's ancient symbol, present on the city's coat of arms, standing atop the Royal Liver building on the waterfront. The sculpture is, depending on how you view it, either a fitting tribute or a gentle irony. A monument built from the components that were once manufactured on this site, standing above the ground where that manufacturing happened. A metal bird made of metal toys, watching over a landscape of chain stores and car parks. The sculpture acknowledges, it honours. It provides a point of reference for anyone who knows the history, a sign that something once mattered here. But the factory is gone. The workers are scattered or retired or dead. The machinery that ran 3 shifts a day for 65 years has been scrapped, sold or sits in private collections. The sounds and smells and rhythms of Binns Road exist now only in memory, and those memories fade with each year that passes. What remains is the absence. If you stand in the shopping park on a quiet weekday morning, before the stores open, before the car park fills, you can feel the scale of what is not there. The buildings that once spread across 6 acres. The workers who once walked through gates that no longer exist. The products that were once made on this ground and shipped around the world. The Meccano Liverbird cannot bring any of it back. It can only mark the place where it happened. A monument to an industry that taught children how to build, erected on the site where that teaching was manufactured. The question that opened this film has no comfortable answer. How does a factory that defined a childhood, that shaped a district's identity, that put Liverpool engineering in the hands of children across the world? How does it go from empire to empty ground in the space of a single generation? The explanations are available. Economic shifts, changing consumer preferences, the rise of plastic, the arrival of faster toys, the corporate logic that closes unproductive facilities. The decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, or at least defensible, leading, step by step, to an ending no one wanted. But explanations are not the same as understanding. You can trace the causation without capturing the loss. What was lost when Binns Road closed was not merely jobs, though 950 jobs is not a small thing. What was lost was not merely a building, though 245,000 square feet of manufacturing history is not easily replaced. What was lost was a way of being in the world. Frank Hornby's patent described a toy that was also an educational device, a way of teaching children how things fit together, how an axle turns, how a gear meshes, how the physical world operates according to principles that can be understood, manipulated, mastered. The factory that manufactured these lessons was, in its own way, an education too, a place where workers learned skills and passed them on, where generations of the same families built lives around the same machines, where the rhythm of the shifts structured the rhythm of the neighbourhood, and the product that emerged had weight and permanence. That world is gone, not just in Liverpool, everywhere. The factories that once anchored working-class communities have largely vanished. The jobs that could be started without credentials and held for a lifetime have been automated or offshored. The wage packet that could support a family is harder to find now than it was when Binns Road was running 3 shifts. The children who play with toys today do not, for the most part, play with metal. They do not learn the tolerance of a bolt in a hole, the patience required to build something that works. The screens they grow up with teach different lessons, valuable lessons perhaps, but different ones. This is not a lament for a golden age that never quite existed. Binns Road had its difficulties. The work was hard, the pay was modest, the future that the workers occupied for was not guaranteed even before the closure. But something real was made there, something that mattered to the people who made it and the children who received it. The loss of that reality leaves a space that retail parks and heritage sculptures cannot fill. The workers who fought for Binns Road through that winter of 1979 and 80 understood something that spreadsheets could not capture. They understood that a factory is not just a building or a business. It is a community, a source of meaning, a place where people contribute something tangible to the world and receive, in return, not just wages, but identity. When that is taken away, quickly, without appeal, with minutes of warning, the loss extends beyond economics. It touches something deeper, the sense that work should matter, that loyalty should be reciprocated, that the places where we spend our lives should not vanish while we are still living them. The Meccano Liverbird stands over the roundabout where the factory gates used to be. Its metal strips catch the light on bright days. Its bolts and brackets hold firm against the Liverpool wind. It is a monument and a memorial, a tribute, and perhaps an accusation, though it makes no explicit claims. The children who might once have learned from Meccano sets now learn from other things. The engineers who might once have traced their understanding back to Binns Road now find their foundations elsewhere. The factory that taught a way of thinking about the world has been replaced by stores that sell things made in other countries, by other workers, using other methods. And in the streets around Edge Lane, in the terraced houses that once sent workers walking toward the factory gates, life continues. Diminished in some ways, changed in others. The memories fading as the years pass and the people who hold them grow fewer. What remains is the question. What happens to a place when its reason for existing disappears? What happens to the people who built their lives around something that seemed permanent and proved not to be? What happens to the skills, the knowledge, the ways of working that accumulated over decades and then, in a matter of months, scattered into the wind? The Meccano liverbird cannot answer. It can only stand, as monuments do, marking the place where something once was. Its metal components, the strips and brackets and bolts that Frank Hornby patented more than a century ago, hold their shape against time. But the factory they honour is gone. The workers who made the miniature world have moved on or passed on, and the sound of the presses, the rhythm of the shifts, the warmth of a Friday wage packet, these exist now only in stories. Only in the memories of those who were there. Only in the quiet that falls over Edge Lane on a winter morning, when the traffic pauses and the wind drops, and you can almost hear, if you listen carefully enough, the ghost of a works hooter marking the start of a shift that will never come again. Almost.